To say that Resident Evil made an impact not just on video games but on pop culture in general is, let's be honest, a bit of an understatement. From its initial release on the PlayStation 1 in 1996, it spawned a franchise that includes, amongst other things, statues, novels, comics, clothing, pin badges, mugs, soundtracks, sunglasses, pop vinyls, and those strange tubs duck figure things which I personally have never seen the point of. It also spawned a billion-dollar film franchise which, if we're honest, ranged from the guilty pleasure / average at best to the outright awful. With the first game being both a critical and commercial success, a sequel was soon announced, and fans like myself were quickly chomping at the bit to get the next instalment of the series, and would spend the next year gazing over screenshots in gaming magazines of the game that was going to be bigger and better than Resident Evil 1. However, things didn't go according to plan, and due to the developers at Capcom not being happy with the game as it approached its March 1997 release date, decided to scrap the game at roughly 70% complete and start over. The result, after an 18-month delay, being the Resident Evil 2 we all know and love today, and a game which is widely regarded, and rightfully so, as the best in the series. And before anyone says anything, no, I'm sorry, Resident Evil 4 is not the best in the series. But what happened to that scrap version of Resident Evil 2, now referred to as Resident Evil 1.5? What happened to the version that never saw the light of day? The version whose images of stark, blue, cold, creepy looking police stations infested with zombie cops filled magazine pages for nearly 12 months? What happened to the version that promised us G-Virus / zombie gorillas and a completely different William Birkin to the one we eventually got, which did actually look a lot better than the original design, to be fair? And what happened to Elsa Walker, the university student and biker whose brief appearance in the series came about by her crashing a bike through the front of the Raccoon City Police Department reception? Welcome to Fistful of Gamepad, I'm Rick, and this is a sort of review of Resident Evil 1.5, the survival horror game thought dead, now resurrected. After its huge critical and commercial success, a sequel to Resident Evil was greenlit by Capcom just 1 month after its release, with a plan to build and expand on the original in every way. Resident Evil 1 director Shinji Mikami would hand over directing duties to Hideki Kamiya and would take on a producer's role. The game went full steam ahead into development, and we were soon treated to images and screenshots of new environments, new characters, and details of a new story. This time round, Chris and Jill from Resident Evil 1 are gone, and you take control of 2 new protagonists, RPD cop Leon S. Kennedy and university student Elsa Walker, and you must escape Raccoon City, which has become overrun with waves of the Walking Dead. At the time, I couldn't wait for Resident Evil 2 to come out, and would read through magazines and discuss with my mates at school what we thought the new game was going to be like. What new features, what new characters, what new enemies were going to be in it, how it would affect the story development, and what new gameplay mechanics would be included. From seeing small screenshots in magazines, we discussed the inclusion of things like how your character's clothes would get blood-stained and show visible damage the more damage you took, something I'd never seen in a game before.
Symptoms similar to those displayed by their attackers.
Things like, if you shot a zombie close up with a shotgun, it would blow them in half, leaving their upper torso crawling along the floor trying to get you. We'd ask questions like, if the Cerberus are police dogs this time round, that will mean that they'll be able to track you down easier and be more vicious. Even though at the time I didn't own a PS1, as me and my brother shared an N64, I couldn't have been more excited for this game, which was shaping up to be something very special of a sequel. However, over in Japan, things weren't so positive, as producer Shinji Mikami and the higher-ups at Capcom weren't happy with the overall level of development of the game and the general direction it was going, as they thought it was too similar to the first game. So they hired Noboru Sugimura, a professional screenwriter, to try and rectify some of these issues. Sugimura's suggestion from a story and narrative perspective was to scrap it and start over, on a game that was roughly 70% complete at the time, which is what they did, and 18 months later we got the Resident Evil 2 we know today. The cancelled version, often referred to as Resident Evil 1.5, would then be seemingly lost forever, stored on the Capcom servers or on a disc in an office desk drawer, destined to never see the light of day. However, after numerous stories of beta versions being bought at estate sales,
welcome,
proposed selling of said beta,
What are you selling?
numerous deceptions,
Got some rare things on sale, stranger.
actual sell-ins and proposed rebuildings of the game,
Thank you.
further deceptions,
Ah,
and attempted sell-ins of said developed game.
I'll buy it at a high price.
In 2013, a version called Resident Evil 1.5 Magic Zombie Door, or MZD build, was released online. An actual playable version of Resident Evil 1.5 that was being lovingly restored by a group of developers who had bought the original 1.5 version. To this day, this version has received regular updates, with the most recent one being January of this year. For the full story on these events and how the prototype came to be discovered, bought and rebuilt, please check out Wang's video Finding the Lost Resident Evil 2 Gaming Mysteries, which I'll link below. It's a fantastic video on a quite astounding series of events. So, after nearly 25 years, I decided it was time to experience the game that had been an urban legend in the gaming community. A game that 15-year-old me never thought he'd get to play. A game that I thought would only exist via screenshots and pixelated videos from 1997. It does need to be noted that this is neither a finished nor official version of the game and is still very much a work in progress, so aspects like stability, glitches and defined boundaries of scenery are apparent. I was running the latest build of the game via the DuckStation PS1 emulator, both of which are easily available online, as well as plenty of tutorials on YouTube that can guide you through how to get it up and running, but it's very straightforward. So I finally booted up the game that I've been waiting nearly 25 years to play. I was running it on my Dell G3 gaming laptop, which is by no means a gaming colossus, and the game runs absolutely fine. In the emulator setting, I deliberately turned off any hardware acceleration as I wanted to try and keep it visually as close to how it would have looked if released back in 1997. As Elsa Walker was a character that got cancelled and replaced with Claire Redfield, I opted to play as her first before Leon. It should also be mentioned that, as opposed to Resident Evil 2, Leon and Elsa's paths were apparently never meant to cross in Resident Evil 1.5, and the game would have two separate campaigns. The story of both characters is to escape from Raccoon City. Throughout her story, Elsa teams up with a guy called John, and then later meets Sherry Birkin. In Leon's story, he teams up with Marvin Branner, who this time around hasn't been chowed down on by the undead, and a scientist called Ada, who I think we can all assume is Ada Wong. Anyone who's played the classic Resident Evils before will be able to pick this up and play it no problem. Controls are the same as previous classic Resident Evils, adopting the classic tank controls, which I still argue to this day is the way to play Resident Evil and my preferred control method, but I guess I'm just showing my age now. Overall, this is traditional, old school Resident Evil. You have to explore various areas to find items, to open doors, to progress. Along the way, you'll build up your arsenal with more powerful weapons to be able to dispatch the decaying undead that seek to dine on you. Difficulty wise, there's just one setting at the moment, which, until you get the shotgun, is a bit of a challenge, as the zombies soak up a lot of bullets before they go down and stay down, compared to that of Resident Evil 1 and 2. Also, no sooner have the undead hit the ground than they're back up like Lazarus, and it'll take 2 or 3 times more of pumping them full of lead before they fall back, go down and stay down. To temporarily put a zombie down with your handgun, you're looking at 5 bullets. To put them down for good, you're looking at 15. It's not until you get the shotgun that you feel you're actually able to effectively fend off the fleshy feasters, where a close-up blast will result in you completely blowing their arms and head off. Blowing their legs off leaves their top half and 2 bloody stumps on the floor crawling towards you. Zombie dogs, aka Cerberuses, are similar and take more shots to put them down compared to Resident Evil 1. Now, you could argue this could be attributed to them being police dogs and tougher than the guard dogs at the Spencer Mansion, but I found the best thing to do was to run, and only shoot them if it'll give you the time and space you need to make your escape. One main item missing from Resident Evil 1.5 are the herbs, a staple of recovering your health in Resident Evil 1. These Arclay Mountain native herbs have been replaced with vials of green, red and blue medicine, which are derived from the herbs. These can be found scattered throughout the police station, which you can pick up and mix to heal yourself. The first aid sprays make a return, but this time there are also antidote sprays, which I'm assuming you'll use if you get poisoned, similar to the blue herb. With the game running on an emulator, you can save your progress anytime, anywhere. It does look like save points, similar to the first game, were included, this time taking the form of either a phone or a computer, but at the moment they're not functional. Also, when you go to use the typewriter, which are scattered around the PlayStation, it says. This I thought was a nice little in-joke to help show that, at the time, this was going to be a newer, more modern Resident Evil compared to the first one. If you access the load game screen via the title screen, the image of a typewriter, which greeted you in Resident Evil 1, has now been replaced with that of a computer. However, you can't load your game from this screen. Item boxes make a return in 1.5, but rather than being the old metal creaky chests that you were used to in Resident Evil 1, these chests, again looking to showcase both the modern aesthetic of the PlayStation and emphasise how, at the time, this was going to be a more modern game over the first, are much more sleek and modern looking. However, at the moment, in this current version of the game, you're unable to use them, but this will most likely be rectified in later versions. For the time being, you must manually discard the items you no longer need, which in itself raises all sorts of inventory associated dilemmas, as you don't know if you'll need to use an item again once you've used it, as you're not prompted to discard the item if it's no longer required like in other games. You have to make that decision yourself. Plus, once you've discarded an item by pressing select in the inventory, it's gone for good and you can't re-pick it up. However, if you do have the item in your inventory, you are prompted more to use it. Another staple of Resident Evil which is missing at the moment are the clues and elements of exposition which you find left strewn around the areas you explore, usually via diaries or journal logs. I feel that this really did help create a sense of tension and atmosphere and condoned a sense of isolation that the writer was feeling at the time and you as your character were feeling then. Sadly, apart from a brief journal entry from Chris which you start with, which outlines the police force's initial response to the outbreak, there are no specific diary or journal entries to be found at the moment. These would be really effective if they're presented via computer logs, where you read police reports of the gradual escalation of the zombie outbreak and where certain items or weapons are stored within the police station to help you progress and survive. But again, I'm sure these will make an appearance in future versions. You do find some clues as you progress, like door codes that you find on scraps of paper on dead bodies or passed out survivors, but more often than not, any puzzles you encounter, like the one in the firing range, you're left to work out on your own, which for any seasoned Resident Evil player won't be a problem, it's just a case of trial and error. The descriptive lines of text that describe the environment you're currently exploring, which help create an atmosphere and a sense of unease in Resident Evil 1, are back for this version, which, like the journal entries, I was a big fan of. Hearing the thoughts of your character as they look at disturbing paintings, or a dead body they find slumped on the floor, all adds to the atmosphere of the game. There are also humorous inclusions, like when Elsa takes the gun from the dead police officer and says to herself, "I'll just borrow this." This helps to flesh the characters out a bit more and gives you more of an insight into their personality. I do need to mention the inclusion of a mini-disc player as one of the items you use to progress. As a means of a time capsule and to pinpoint a moment in history, it doesn't get more 90s than a mini-disc player. I was well into mini-disc back in the late 90s and early 2000s and went through about 3 personal mini-disc players, and I still have my mini-disc hi-fi to this day. So to see the inclusion of mini-disc, for me, was a nice bit of nostalgia that really did make me smile. Navigation wise, you're given a map at the start which you can use to help navigate round. Your inventory is pretty much the same as in Resident Evil 1, just slightly rearranged. Exploring the inventory uncovers other weapons and items that were planned to be used in the game, such as hand grenades, machine gun, and Akuma's head, which you can find later on in the game, and this is a reference to an EGM April Fool's Day prank involving the original Resident Evil 2. When you start the game, the first thing that strikes you is the design of the police station and how much it differs from the one we got in Resident Evil 2. Gone is the grand gothic wooden brick clad converted art museum RPD. What we have here is a much more modern looking RPD with lots of bare concrete walls, steel and glass. It's very much a darker, stark, minimalist look and approach to the environment. This I feel makes the game a lot more claustrophobic and gives the RPD a very cold feeling and creates a real feeling of isolation. The open areas of the reception in Resident Evil 2 are now much more enclosed. Offices are much more populated with cluttered desks, which create a maze where the increased number of zombies on screen can chase and trap you. Graphically, the game is a noticeable improvement over Resident Evil 1, the original that is, not the remake, and showcases some fantastically detailed and beautiful pre-rendered backgrounds. The quality of the backgrounds is truly second to none and adds so much in creating a feeling of tension, dread, and an atmosphere of isolation, apprehension and fear. They work so well in helping to tell a story of what has happened previously before you arrived and give exposition to the story. It also makes you wonder, for example, with the crashed police van that you find, if a pre-rendered cinematic sequence was planned to explain how it ends up in a fiery smashed heap. I personally really like the concept of walking into an environment where a lot has happened and you're left breadcrumb clues via the environment, which is basically telling you the story of what's gone on. It's like each room in Resident Evil tells its own story. Particular rooms I liked were Chief Irons' office, with its huge Venetian blind covered windows showing the Raccoon City skyline, complete with flashing lights, as it gave the feeling of a deep, expansive city with all sorts of danger just waiting. Another room I really liked was the armoury, which as you explore it you find a rocket launcher which has a tag on it which says "Evidence from the Arklay incident, do not manipulate," which was a nice little reference to Resident Evil 1. Detail on the zombies, both human and dogs, has been improved over Resident Evil 1, as the zombified cops are quite varied in the design, which is a nice touch, as the zombies in Resident Evil 1 did look a bit cut and paste. The zombies aren't hugely varied in the design, certainly not to the extent of Resident Evil 2, but I think this was more to do with the PS1's limitations. But there are more zombies present on screen this time compared to Resident Evil 1, sometimes up to 5 or 6, and they can be fast moving. Now I wouldn't say they're as detailed as the ones we would later come to find in Resident Evil 2, but I'm guessing that the downgrade in detail in 1.5 was a compromise made to get more zombies on screen. But I like the Resident Evil 1.5 zombie look. I think it makes them look more haggard and rotten. However, the infected / zombie gorillas are a new addition that I'm not as keen on, and I'm not entirely sure would have worked if they'd have made it into the Resident Evil 2 that we later got. They seem very out of place, and for me they just don't work. With this game being a work in progress, assets from Resident Evil 2 have been used in piecing the game together. Examples being the bullets from Tony's arms, Robert Kendo being used for the character of John, and a character model that looks very similar to Leon being used for the character of RPD Officer Roy. There are also a few glitches and bugs here and there. Examples of these include backgrounds not being set properly so it would appear that you're walking over the scenery, zombies disappearing off screen when you've kicked them, and crows being suspended in midair when you've shot them rather than falling to the floor. However, I'm sure that these will be resolved in future updates, and you can always use the easily accessible debug menu to re-enter a room if necessary. However, one aspect that did cause me grief was the stun locking that appears when you find yourself surrounded by a group of zombies. Once one has you, you're not given a chance or small window to be able to escape once you've fought them off. Consequently, you end up getting repeatedly ping-ponged from one zombie to another until you're ultimately dead. But again, I'm sure this will get resolved in future updates. The battle damage is a feature that I really like. Seeing how your clothes get blood stained with increased damage was a really inventive touch. However, I think signifying your change in health via your stance that we got in Resident Evil 2 works a lot better. This also creates more tension if you're trying to get away from an enemy who was closing in on you and all you can do is hobble as you've got no first aid spray or herb to hand. The famous Resident Evil door animations at the moment are not present, but I'm sure they'll be added in later versions. The soundtrack in Resident Evil 1.5 is a standout for me personally and a real highlight. It's very creepy and really creates a sense of unease and an overall feeling of dread and doom as you feel that all the evil around you is slowly closing in on you. It's a very different soundtrack to Resident Evil 2, which went for a more grand, gothic and orchestral feel to mimic its gothic environment, compared to 1.5's more modern approach, which mimics its more modern building design. Overall, if I had to choose which soundtrack I preferred, it'd be very hard to choose between the two.
Richard, what happened?
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
The famous Resident Evil voice acting is sadly not present in this version. Instead, we get text. I do remember seeing a trailer though back in the day where we are introduced to Leon, who says,
Oh, that's just freaking great. Now what am I gonna do?
And there was also a clip of Elsa and Sherry.
Elsa, I know a secret way in. A secret entrance? It's here. Look, I can get inside through this hole. Sherry, wait.
The groans of the zombies are the usual generic ghoulish groans that we all know and love, and the sound of the whirling wind outside is a very effective addition and adds a creepy touch and feel to things. It really does hammer home and remind you that you're all alone and isolated in this huge city. There are a few small sound effects missing at the moment, but again, these didn't detract from my enjoyment of the game, as with this being a work in progress, I'm sure will make an appearance in future updates. Overall, the sound absolutely adds to the effectiveness of the game and really helps in drawing you in and building a tense and creepy atmosphere. Again, as this is a work in progress, it's very difficult to comment on the length of the game as it's not complete yet, but what I did play absolutely kept me gripped and I wanted to explore more and more of this alternate Raccoon City. I would absolutely play this game again and I'll continue to watch its development. I'm already looking forward to the next update. And to be honest, and this is just my humble opinion, I've been a gamer for over 30 years and a Resident Evil fan since it first came out, I would much rather play this than the likes of Resident Evil 4, 5 and definitely 6. Overall, playing Resident Evil 1.5 was like watching a completely different cut of one of my favourite films of all time, and for me it was an amazing nostalgic experience, but one tainted with both sadness and mild disappointment. To play a game that I've been waiting nearly 25 years to play, a game that I would stare at screenshots of in magazines and chat endlessly with my friends at school about what we could expect from this sequel and how it was going to surpass the original, only for it then to be cancelled and then possibly lost to the annals of gaming history, to then be actually able to play that game and be taken back to being 15 years old and experiencing and seeing what could have been was an amazing experience. To explore this alternative RPD and Raccoon City, places I've spent endless hours exploring over the years, over many games, and that I know so well, was a real eye-opener and an interesting journey into what could have been. Having aspects from Resident Evil 1.5 in the Resident Evil 2 remake was an amazing addition and was a loving tribute to a game that never was, but to be able to experience them in their original form, for me, was something special. Would it have been better than the Resident Evil 2 we eventually got nearly 18 months later? I'm going to say no, as Resident Evil 2 was a more in-depth game that expanded on the story more than 1.5 could by the inclusion of Claire Redfield. It also had the interlinking A and B games, as well as the inclusion of additional modes, which just added to the replayability. My sadness and disappointment stem from the fact that we are unlikely to ever get an official release of Resident Evil 1.5 from Capcom, which is simultaneously unfortunate and baffling. Unfortunate, as I and most likely all Resident Evil fans all over the world want to see what was supposed to happen in Resident Evil 1.5. We want to see this alternative Resident Evil reality without the Redfields. I want to see what happened to rookie cop Leon and university student Elsa and how their journeys affect the Resident Evil world. Speaking of the 1.5 world, I want to see more of it. I want to see more of the modern RPD with its modern look of cold concrete, stark steel and modern glass architecture. I want to know what was the story, if any, behind the proposed new Raccoon City model that you see in Irons' office. I want to know more about Roy and John from Elsa's story, and overall how the stories of both Leon and Elsa were different. I also find it baffling how Capcom have seemingly abandoned Resident Evil 1.5. Like it was a mistake, like it was something they experimented with and then binned, like some form of game equivalent of Lisa Trevor, leaving it the rejected, unwanted edition of the series. Now, granted games do go through changes during the development, but 1.5 is different, as that was meant to be the game, not a beta. I do believe that if Capcom were to invest in finishing the game and release it in the way that they had intended back in 1997, even though we did get Resident Evil 2, which is a better game and in my opinion the best game in the whole Resident Evil series. I'm sorry, it's not Resident Evil 4. Even though we had the remake, which did include elements of 1.5 and is one of the best games of the previous console generation and hands down one of, if not the best remake to date. I still think if Capcom were to finish 1.5 and release it digitally as a budget title for say £19.99 in the UK, $25 in North America, $32 Canadian, it would sell like crazy and easily recoup the money invested and then some. Because it's a curio, it's a piece of gaming history, and it's something that for ages was part of gaming folklore. But as this is never going to happen, as gamers we need to count ourselves lucky that we have passionate, talented fans who are giving fellow fans what they want when big companies aren't willing to. Otherwise, we'd never be able to experience games like Resident Evil 1.5. If you're a Resident Evil fan, you're never going to get a better opportunity to play a part of Resident Evil history, and it's now never been easier to experience what could have been. Do yourself a favour and download and experience this game. Again, it's a work in progress and I'll continue to review the updates as they're released because as a huge Resident Evil fan, I can't recommend this game enough. And there we have it. That brings us to the end of my sort of review of Resident Evil 1.5. If you have any memories of Resident Evil 1.5 from back in the day, please put them in the comments below. I'd be really interested to hear them. And as always, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you again.